In two previous videos we showed that when you have two PPF curves for, say, the US and Cuba, you get the PPF curves, the lines drawn in blue and red. And we also found that when it comes to which country has a comparative advantage, that Cuba has a comparative advantage in sugar, because for every sugar it makes, it only has to give up half of a beer, whereas for the U.S., for it to make one sugar, it has to give up a whole beer. Well, if Cuba has a comparative advantage in sugar, then it will necessarily be the case that U.S. has the comparative advantage in beer. Now, the purpose of this video is to talk about what happens when U.S. and Cuba do not trade and then they trade. The idea being, in the next video we're going to show how that always leads both countries to a wealthier point. And to set this up, notice what I've got here. I've got a rectangle that's going to denote production, how much a country is producing, and a circle to denote how much it's consuming. And let's start with the U.S. I'm going to assume that before trade, the U.S. is producing 5 sugar and 5 beer, and it's also consuming 5 sugar and 5 beer. We're doing a thought experiment. We're saying, what if the U.S. doesn't trade with anybody? Well, if the U.S. doesn't trade with anybody, the only things that they can consume or what they produce. So the rectangle is on the circle, production equals consumption, and the same thing can be said for Cuba. I've got them consuming and producing 4 sugar and 3 beer. When the U.S. and Cuba go from not trading to engaging in trade, what they're going to do is both are going to produce the good that they're best at. That just makes sense, right? Each country should do what they do best. And then for the good they don't produce anymore, they trade for it. So if we think of the U.S., instead of producing and consuming 5 beer and 5 sugar, since they have a comparative advantage in beer, they are only going to produce beer. So I'm going to put my rectangle at 10. They're going to produce 10 beer, no sugar. For Cuba, they have a comparative advantage in sugar, so they're going to produce only sugar. So U.S. produces only beer, Cuba produces only sugar. But each country wants both, meaning the U.S. doesn't want to consume only beer, it wants sugar too. Cuba doesn't want to consume only sugar, it wants beer too. And so what they're going to do, each country has plenty of the good that they have a comparative advantage in, but they don't have any of the good for which they don't have a comparative advantage. So what they do is they took the good, the only good they're producing that they're making a lot of, and they're trading it for the thing that they're not very good at producing. The U.S. has lots of beer, it needs sugar, so it's going to export some of its beer to Cuba, trade some of that beer for Cuba's sugar, and import sugar into the U.S. If you look at it from Cuba's point of view, Cuba's exporting sugar to the U.S. and importing some of U.S.'s beer. Now what's going to happen, remember, the U.S. they were consuming right here 5 beer and 5 sugar. The way trade works, it's always going to be the case that the U.S. is going to be able to get a little bit more of beer and sugar than they could before. They're going to consume somewhere out here. You know, they might be consuming out here, even here. But we know that after trade, U.S. is going to be consuming out here, one of those infeasible points that they could never, ever reach without trade. Likewise, Cuba, they're going to get some more beer and more sugar. We don't know exactly where they're going to be consuming out here, but they are going to be consuming at was formerly one of those infeasible regions. And the denouement of all this is that both Cuba and the U.S. are able to consume an amount of beer and sugar that they never could without trade. And so with trade, both get something for nothing. To see some actually numerical examples of how this will be the case, there's going to be another video for that.